And over the past week, we've just seen a lot of violence in Afghanistan. A Christian aid worker was killed. There's just been a lot of strife outside of the city of Kabul as well. But there are, as you said, positive stories. Habiba Sakar, Khaled just referred to the governor of Bamiyan province. She's the first and only female governor in the country of Afghanistan, and she's an amazing woman. She ran an underground literacy program, as I understand it, during the period of the Taliban, and she then became the Minister of Women's Affairs and is now the governor of Bamiyan province. And I'm just wondering, Khaled, do you fear that that it's gotten so bad now that people might have to start going underground again in that way?
Oh God, I hope not. But there is, I think, a disturbing trend towards religious conservatism in Afghanistan. The Afghan constitution says that men and women are equal, but it's a piece of paper. It really depends on who's sitting in the legislative, who is implementing these laws and passing judgment. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are in those powerful positions are deeply conservative, deeply religious people who continue to, I think, have a non-progressive view of the role of a woman in society. It just doesn't just pertain to women, but I think very dramatically with women. And I think court reform in Afghanistan and legislative reform in Afghanistan is one of the big challenges and one of the areas where I think in the rebuilding of Afghanistan we have kind of failed. We can't allow these sorts of things to happen. This poor journalism student who downloaded an article, from the internet that's in some fashion, raised, I think, a valid question about Islam. As a 24-year-old young man who's been in prison for the last year was sentenced to 20 years for the act of just downloading this article. It's deplorable. And I just hope that as the years go by, you have to be patient, but as the years go by, these kinds of things, we'll see less and less of it and things will improve.
Linda Kern, who is an assistant professor and head of, I believe, research and instructional services here at Brenau, had this question for you. She says, Khaled, 1,000 Splendid Suns chronicles bleak and harrowing experiences of abuse, violence, and war. Yet for a people to survive, they must have both hope and joy. In what do the Afghan people find their hope and especially their joy, especially right now?
The Afghans are a remarkably resilient and hopeful and optimistic and positive people, even when faced with pretty unspeakable conditions. Most Afghan children either know somebody who's suffered an act of violence or have seen it. We have, the statistics are, you mentioned them, very, very difficult. And yet, the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission did a survey last year in 32 provinces, I think over 15,000 people, where the question being asked was, are you optimistic about your future, the future of your country? And you know what percentage of people said they were optimistic? Over 80%. I'm not sure we would get those numbers in this country.
Definitely not right now.
Definitely not right now. It's not to say that they're happy with the way things are. No. In fact, quite the opposite. They're very upset with the way things have gone so far. But they maintain a sense of hope. They're very industrious people. Given little, they can accomplish a lot. A small example of that is how effective microfinancing has been in Afghanistan. You give, especially with women, you give them a little bit of money, and they find a way of creating a livelihood for their family. And the women pay it back. Not always the guys, but the women pay it back. And so I think it's this sense of hope and optimism and resilience and strength that's carried them forward. I saw it for myself when I went to Afghanistan in 2003, and I would talk to people on the street and hear these things that they had survived through, the constant shelling and the fighting. And there's a line in the book where one of the characters said there were so many rockets flying during the Civil War, you could read the newspaper in the light of it. And that's something that somebody actually told me when I was there. And they counted 2,000 rockets falling on Kabul in one single day. I mean, just city being completely destroyed. And yet they went on. They kept going, and they still have hope for their future. So, it's one of the really most admirable traits of people in Afghanistan, which I think then renders, if we were to abandon them again, if we were to fail them again and not follow through with the things we have promised it, which I think in my mind makes it that much of a bigger tragedy if that were to happen.
Mm-hmm. Now comes my fun part, which is to talk politics with you. I
thought we did quite a bit.
No, we're going to talk real politics now. I was really surprised to come back from my vacation in Costa Rica to find out about an op-ed that you wrote in the Washington Post. It was entitled, "McCain and Palin Are Playing with Fire." You didn't speak very favorably about the way that McCain and Palin have not addressed the anti-Obama hecklers at their rallies. I'm just going to read a bit of a quote from your op-ed so that everyone here who might not have read it can appreciate
Hold your
it.
tomatoes, please.
You stated, quote, "The Taliban are clawing their way back in Afghanistan, the country that I hope many of my fellow Americans have come to understand better through my novels. People are losing their homes and their jobs and are watching the future slip away from them. But instead of addressing these problems, the McCain-Palin ticket is doing its best to distract Americans by provoking fear, anxiety, and hatred." You've also said that you prefer to discuss politics through your novels. So
yeah,
why did you write this
here.
op-ed?
No, look, every 4 years, election season, we see the vitriol. I mean, it's to be expected. I think people try to misrepresent each other's positions. They kind of have their own slant on somebody's record and how they've voted. And we see it over and over again. It's a political election. It's to be expected. We know it. But I think in the post-9/11 world, with the wounds still there, and given that we are engaged in 2 wars where 4,000 U.S. soldiers have died in Iraq and over 600 in Afghanistan, and given the reality of the world today, it's a very, very serious charge to tie somebody to terrorism. I think it's a charge that should be made very, very soberly, and it's irresponsible to just kind of throw out a phrase like that, especially in a country where, at a time when people are desperate, where people are committing suicide because they're being evicted, because their homes are being foreclosed, where people need to find somebody to blame, where people are angry. I think it's irresponsible to whip up the crowd with these kinds of charges of saying somebody is palling around with terrorists, that they don't see America the way you do, that the middle name is Hussein, the connotation being it's a pejorative term because they belong, they come from Islamic tradition. This kind of thing, I think, goes beyond the usual kind of dirty tricks that we see in politics and steps into the boundary of being irresponsible and dangerous. And I was really disappointed that nobody from the McCain campaign said, that stopped and said, we cannot have this kind of talk. We cannot